Hey guys, welcome back to another lecture, and this one is going to be on Hinduism, getting us introduced to Hinduism. Most of you probably don't have any experience with it. I know one or two of you do, but the rest of you probably it's very much a mystery. So we're going to kind of get started from the beginning. One of the things you'll notice, I'm not going to do as much critical analysis of the texts as I normally do. This is for a couple of reasons. Number one, Hindus don't tend, and again, we're painting with really broad brushes, so don't get too married to all the little details. They're not going to be true 100% for anything, right? But Hindus tend not to be all that concerned about the difference between myth and history. They see time very, very differently than we do. Second of all, from our own perspective, there's no real pretense that these texts are historical in the way that we think of modern history, and in the way a lot of people in the monotheistic traditions tend to think of their own texts. And this includes like very conservative Jews, Christians, and Muslims. So it's almost kind of not worth it to talk about it, because there's no pretense in our culture by anybody that Krishna was a real person and that the gods actually have blue skin or whatever. So we're not going to spend as much time, or probably any time, going through those texts and talking about it critically like that. So welcome to Hinduism, part 1, number 3 of the COVID lectures, which I am starting to call them now, trying to give them a unified title in a way. We are looking at Hinduism. One of the things that people notice about Hinduism is that it is incredibly, it can be very confusing. It's kind of dizzyingly confusing and colorful. It is incredibly bright. It is diverse. There's a huge amount of diversity in Hinduism. It is beautiful in its own very unique ways. It's really quite kind of a spectacle in a lot of ways. It's incredibly complex. It is not. It kind of makes the monotheistic traditions look easy when you start analyzing and trying to figure it out. There are thousands and thousands of gods in Hinduism. It also embraces both the light and the dark in a way that a lot of monotheistic people who hold to those monotheistic traditions do. They don't. They're not so much worried about the duality of God and the devil and things like that we tend to see in the Abrahamic traditions. And it's not really a single thing. So, what is it? One of the things you need to realize, and one of the things we need to think about, is that the idea of unity in India is an idea that was created by the West. Other countries or other cultures going into India from the West, other cultures that are married to this idea of a unity, right? Trying to unify Christianity, trying to unify Islam, right? It never worked. But there were constantly efforts to try to do so, try to create a single correct method or way of believing, a single correct creed, a single correct interpretation of the sacred texts. This unity does not exist in Hinduism, and they don't even pretend to have that kind of unity. It's really a large conglomeration of polytheistic beliefs, and they don't deny the validity of any other belief. Different people need different things from their religion, and they completely embrace that. So it's very much kind of like Islam in the Kaaba, right? Remember that we were talking about the Kaaba and it was polytheistic, but really what people were doing was henotheism, where you hold that one God for yourself, but all of the other gods are perfectly valid, and you're not discussing, you're not debating, you're not trying to deny anybody else's beliefs. You're just saying, this is my God. Shiva is my God. But if you want to worship Vishnu or Kali or Durga or Indra or whatever, that's okay. Rock on. Or Jesus or Allah. Perfectly fine. You go do your thing, I'm going to do my thing. And so there's this really interesting respect for diversity that comes out of India. Currently, that's being really challenged with Narendra Modi. He is in many subtle ways, kind of like here, trying to exclude Islam from that diverse picture. But historically, Hindus or people of India have accepted diversity in a way that most other cultures have found much more challenging. There are hundreds of thousands and possibly millions of gods in Hinduism, if you include all the little tiny sub gods, right? It's impossible to count them because India is such a big place with so many people. Every family has their own, kind of own religion, sort of, meaning that they can have household gods and they can have ancestral gods, and then they can have their larger deities like Brahma or, like I said, Shiva or Vishnu or Sarasvati. I think that's how you pronounce it. That's how I've always pronounced it. One thing is that Hinduism and the names and the words in Hinduism tend to be very challenging. So if I stumble over them, please forgive me. It's not. They're words that you really have to practice saying to get them out smoothly. So there you go. So when we look at India and we try to make it a unity, it's almost like going to the Far East and looking at Japan and China and Vietnam, and the West walks in and goes, oh, it's all the Far East, right? And to some degree, there is a lot of cultural continuity there. Chopsticks being, for an example, of things that a lot of people in the Far East use. So there's some cultural continuity. But if you dig into it at all, you start to see the incredible diversity and all of those colors come out, right? And you see that the Vietnamese people and their cuisine and their beliefs are very different from China. And even within China, there's a huge amount of diversity from north to south to east to west. Mongolia has its own thing. Hong Kong has its own thing. And then you have Japan, and Japan is a very different thing. It's, again, cultural continuity to some degree, but there's an incredible amount of diversity there. So when we look at India, we see that same kind of diversity, but we also see the West, Europeans, trying to impose some kind of homogeneity that is kind of a, yes, there is some common cultural elements, but there's also there's more diversity than there is in common. So we want to be careful with that. In fact, Hindu isn't even an Indian word. Hinduism, Hindi, is actually a Persian word that comes out of the 12th century. It's not even indigenous to India. So we have to be careful with that as well. When we've talked about religion, a lot of us have an idea of religion, and we've talked about how hard it is to define. In fact, a lot of scholars, and I'm probably one of them, would agree that defining religion is kind of a fool's errand. But I want you to keep in mind that religion, although we still use the word, as indefinable as it may be, for Hindus, religion is not a compartmentalized thing. In the West, and even especially like in Japan, where religion isn't as prevalent, in China, certainly where religion isn't as prevalent, in Europe, we tend to compartmentalize religion, right? So if you're a good Christian, maybe you go to church on Sunday and you might have a cross in your home and maybe you pray at home. But when you wake up in the morning and the alarm goes off, getting ready for work and stuff is not a religious act. It has nothing to do with your religion. Whether you choose to wear, kind of a periwinkle sweater or a t-shirt, or if you choose to call in sick, those are not religiously based. They are not at all part of your faith. But in Hinduism, religion is everywhere. It's in every part of their lives. So it plays into everything that they do. And this is very true of ancient religion and indigenous religion. When we look at the Native Americans, for example, if we get a chance to look at the Sioux, we're going to see the same thing. Everything has significance. The time that you eat, what you eat, how you treat the animal that you're eating, or even the grain that you're eating. all of this is significant to the faith of these people and their spirituality. Culture and religion, the culture and religion of Hinduism might be older than Judaism. We don't know. Both of them kind of go so far back in time that the evidence gets really muddy and obscured. They are competing for the title of oldest living tradition. But again, we have to deal with the question of when did Judaism really become Judaism, right? Was it as early as the Bronze Age, or did it really develop during the Iron Age after the Babylonian exile of 586? And the same is going to be true of Hinduism. We have a couple of cultures that we're going to explore briefly that kind of contribute to what modern Indian culture is today. But the question becomes, are they contributing cultures, or are they in fact Hindu culture in its infancy? And those are questions for historians of Hinduism to answer, not me. I am not a specialist in this area. I fully admit to this. So one of the things we're going to find about Hinduism is, to a great degree, there's a great deal of focus on ritual over creed. And remember, we encountered this question of works versus faith in Judaism, in Christianity, and it's also a question in Islam. And in Islam, works and faith have to work together. You cannot, there's no deathbed conversion for Islam. You have to spend some time praying 5 times a day, practicing the 5 pillars. For Paul in Christianity, it was all faith, and that deathbed conversion was a legit thing. You could be 2 seconds away from death and see the light and have a revelation and, be Christian and go to heaven. So this question of works versus faith, for Hinduism, it's a lot more emphasis on the works, the ritual, what you actually do, how you actually do it. So we're going to take a look at some of that stuff eventually as well, possibly not this lecture, but a little bit later on. All right, so this question of where did Hinduism come from, we have probably 2 sources that have been tracked so far. This does not mean that there won't be sources later on, because remember, in history, if you're doing history correctly, if you're doing it right, history is always going to be shifting. History is always going to be something that is subject to new data, subject to new ideas, subject to new theories. And if your new theory fits the data better, then that should become the prevailing theory. So for right now, we probably have 2 sources for the culture. We have the Indus Valley Civilization, and this is actually a group in Pakistan, which used to be part of India, so in the north. All the archaeology dates from about 3000 BCE to about 1500 BCE, when the empire or the civilization started to really crumble and kind of fall apart. The language has not been fully deciphered. So there are documents, but we can't quite read them. They have uncovered approximately 70 cities in the area, and they call it the Harappan culture. There are a few weapons. They did have indoor plumbing and public baths, which is really, really interesting. When you see public baths, usually what you have there is a sort of concern with ritual cleanliness, right? In Greece and Rome, they did have public baths. It wasn't as focused on ritual cleanliness as much as community, but it was part of the religious culture, especially in Greece. So it's public baths are actually quite common in cultures that are concerned with the community, but also concerned with ritual cleanliness. And this continues in modern Hinduism as well. This question of ritual cleanliness, not actual cleanliness, not did you wash your hands or is your hair dirty? The question is ritual cleanliness, which is a very, very different thing. There are lots of little Venus figures, and I don't know if we talked about this or not, but Venus figures are these little tiny, not little tiny, but small. They're usually about yay big, and they are female figures that have exaggerated, like boobs, exaggerated butt, that kind of thing. And it seems to imply an ability to give birth successfully. They tend to be on the chunky side. We don't see these slender, kind of skinny figures. These are figures that show women who are well fed and can support a child. Their bodies can support a child. And we see them all over Western Europe and Northern Europe. We see them, we actually do kind of see them, a version of them in the Middle East as well. So they're very common in ancient culture. We're not sure what it means. Because these figures come from like the early to, and even in the Chalcolithic and into the early Bronze Age, there's not any writing. We don't have anything written about them, and they're so prolific that it's almost like they're so obvious. Like, why do I need to write this down, kind of a thing. And yet, once they fall out of fashion, nobody talks about them for so long that we don't know what they are. Are they a great goddess? Is it part of the ritual cult? Is there a goddess worship going on? Is it a talisman so that women can get pregnant and have successful childbirth? Is it pornography? And that's something we actually do have to consider. It could be a talisman to get things going and get things started so that children can be born. It could be a combination of things, and it's probably much more complicated than our theories are, but that's usually how it is. Likewise, for the men, or for the male side, bulls seem to be very, very important here. And again, bulls are common all over the place. We see them in the Middle East, and if you read the Bible, the sacred cow, the golden calf incident in Exodus. At Çatalhöyük in Turkey, we see bull imagery all over the place. Mycenae, there's bulls all over the place. Crete, we see lots of bull figures. Bulls tend to be very prominent throughout the region. Even into Europe, we see bulls kind of being important around the cultures that surround Stonehenge. So bull figures, again, play a part in this early Indus Valley civilization. And so we're looking at fertility figures, ideas about virility and potency probably, also figures about strength, right? So all of this kind of stuff works together. And the sacred seems to be very tied in with the sexual. And again, this follows straight into Hinduism today. The Kama Sutra, it's a sex manual, right? It's a sacred sex manual. So again, we see this going through into modern Hinduism. We see lingams. And a lingam is a phallic symbol, usually in stone. It becomes associated with Shiva later on in classical Hinduism, and there's usually a complementary part, the yoni, later on. And we don't see this in the Indus Valley civilization yet, but the lingam is there. So we might have an early precursor to modern day Shiva. And then later on, they're going to include the yoni, which is the feminine part, the vagina, into that sort of iconography as well. The material culture of the Indus Valley civilization is present in India to some degree. So again, we're seeing links back and forth. They fell around 1500. Part of this could be due to incoming Aryan culture that we're going to look at next, but a big part of it is probably due to the fact that the Indus River changed course, and satellite imagery and other archaeogeological studies have shown that the Indus River changed course, and that is always going to have a massive impact on a population. Anytime you have a major river change course, that population is going to really struggle and usually fall. So we're going to take a look. We know that, I do want to point out that we know, or at least it looks like, the Indus Valley civilization did not fall violently. There's not a lot of evidence for war. There's no conflagration layers at the top, which you would find if a civilization falls to war. All right. Next, the Aryans. So they are also coming from the north. They have some important pieces of technology that the Indus Valley civilization did not have. They have domesticated horses. They have chariots. They're using bronze, which is a big step, right? Moving from that Chalcolithic, using flint arrows and stuff, although very effective, Bronze is more malleable. You can do more with it. It's not as brittle, right? So that's an advantage. And they also have the spoked wheel, which I know seems kind of, I don't know, mundane and kind of silly to talk about, but we're talking about the reinvention of the wheel here, right? A spoked wheel is strong, it is sturdy, but it's a lot lighter than a solid wheel, and that is a massive step forward for any civilization. From the Aryans, we do have their language. We have translated, or I should say, archaeologists in this field have translated the Aryan language. They seem to have created the Vedas, and the Vedas are kind of the most sacred text in Hindu civilization today. And the Vedas seem to come from about the first century, or rather, I'm sorry, the second century BCE, late second century. They are oral instructions in ritual, philosophy, and mythology. They were transmitted orally for a very long time. They were not supposed to be written down. They were supposed to be memorized by priests, but eventually it was written down. With the advent of Islam in India, it finally gets written down around the first century CE. So the Vedas, this is a really interesting point, and I want you to kind of put this in the back of your head for those of you who are into language, especially. Sanskrit is the kind of child of the Aryan language. The Aryan language evolves into Sanskrit. Sanskrit is the mother language of Indo-European languages, including Latin and Greek. And of course, all the children that come from Latin, all of those Romance languages are actually related back to this Aryan language through Sanskrit. And Veda is actually the same root as the word video or video in Latin, which means to see. So that VDE root means to see. And Hinduism is very, very focused on seeing and understanding. And of course, the extended metaphoric idea of seeing is understanding, and that's true in the ancient world as well. We talk about seeing. We can also talk about seeing meaning understanding. The West did not get a hold of the Vedas until the 1800s, like the late Enlightenment period, right? It was complete mystery to us. Hinduism was a complete mystery to us. Buddhism was a complete mystery to us. We don't start to see and understand and really get into this ancient stuff out of India until much later. And of course, once we get a hold of it, you can see within 200 years, Hinduism has had a huge impact on Western culture, and the same is going to be true of Buddhism as well. And even then, even when it comes in the 1800s, we still don't really take a hold of it until probably the 1950s, 1960s, when we finally get Western writers writing about it in a way that Western minds can comprehend. The Hindus, the people of India, think so incredibly differently than the West does. And I want you to really, I want you to really pull that in, because the way that they think about time and space is incredibly different than most of us. And for most students, getting introduced to this material, and especially Buddhism, and I love doing this like at Cal State Long Beach. It's not as true for you guys because you guys are so diverse and you've already been exploring a lot of things, much more so than, say, Cal State Long Beach. But when I'm teaching religion at Cal State, I usually introduce Buddhism or Hinduism, and when I start introducing the theology and the way that they think, my first question is, do you understand? And if anybody raises their hand, I have to look at them and go, okay, I didn't do my job. Because this is not something that, if you are strictly a Western thinking person, it's not something you can get your head around very easily. So I want you to kind of, if you haven't explored Hinduism or Buddhism before, I want you to kind of keep an open mind and kind of be flexible with your thinking, because ironically, the indigenous people of North America think in very much the same way. In fact, the reason that I was able to move into Buddhism as easily as I did is because for a few years I had a real fascination with the Native American Sioux tribes. And their way of thinking is very similar to this kind of Eastern Buddhist Hindu way of thinking, which is very cyclical, very circular, not linear the way that monotheistic traditions tend to be. Let's see here. So the mythologically, the Vedas came to this world before time, right? So it contains all of the knowledge. It, like I said, it's the most important scripture in Indian culture, but few Hindus have actually ever read it. Very few people in India have ever read it. It's big, it's complex, it doesn't really make sense. It's ancient literature. And ancient literature is usually really hard to plow through because it's written in such a weird way and they don't always explain themselves well. And especially when you're talking about an oral tradition, it's going to become much more complicated than modern books and whatnot are. Aryan society was divided into 4 classes, and that later becomes the caste system, which we're going to look at later on. So it also appears a little bit in Harappan culture in the Indus Valley. The most important thing in the Vedic religion is going to be fire worship, and we're going to see that as well. All right. Oh, hello, Tessa. All right. I don't know. Let's see. Come here. This is my cat, Contessa. She is very needy. And like I said, I don't have time to do lots of takes on this, so we're going to roll with it. There are 4 Vedas. There is the Rig Veda, which are mantras and hymns to gods. There is the Samveda, which are melodies. There is let's see if I can pronounce this, Yajurveda, I think that's it. These are instructions for sacrifice, which is really, really important. Hinduism still practices sacrifice to a great degree. And then there's the Artha Veda. There we go. And that is like spells for healings and rituals and whatnot. Okay. There is a 3-part system of the universe. Oops, sorry. Okay. Are you done? Can we be done? It's not dinner time yet. Come on. Okay. Sorry. There is a 3-part system to the universe, and to some degree, they ignore the underworld. They do acknowledge it in other places, but for the most part, what we have is like land where people are, and then there's this mid space, and then above that, there is the heavenly spaces where the gods are. And the underworld is not as much of a concern. Now, again, with ancient tradition, indigenous traditions, you're going to see this in all ancient material. It is not concerned with consistency. It is not concerned with continuity. It is not concerned with, being mutually exclusive in its truths. So they'll say one thing in one part and then they'll directly contradict it in another part, and that's okay. Nobody cares. So you're going to have to remain flexible and just kind of take it as it comes. It contains many creation stories. And again, there's no problem with inconsistency. So they can have a creation story and then a different creation story. And they might have nothing in common, but that's okay. The Vedas acknowledge duality, but they seem to be trying to take us beyond duality, right? So as human beings, we think of black, white, or color, no color. We tend to think of here or there. They're trying to get us to move beyond that reality, right? And Buddhism very much does the same thing. Buddhism is trying really hard to pull us out of simple dualism, all right? It acknowledges that we do not know the universe and we cannot know the universe, but it still wants to contemplate it, right? So there's all these huge questions that we can't necessarily know the answers to, but we should not stop thinking about it, okay? The word for deva is also is in the Vedas. So the word in the Vedas for God is deva. It's a divine being. It's not necessarily a god per se. It literally means shining. All right, but we get the word divine from it, divinity, that kind of thing. And the devas, including the gods, are subject to the rules of the universe, and that is called Rita. Rita existed before the gods. All right, they come after. And so even the gods and all of the deva are subject to Rita. Okay? It is not a systematic belief system. It is not as wrapped up and neatly put together as, say, Christianity or Islam or even Judaism at this point, right? Judaism went under a lot of changes after the Babylonian exile. When we look at Ezra and Nehemiah, that's where you start to really get a sense of modern Judaism, and it's much more systematic. This is not going to be systematic. And so, again, we have to remain flexible with it. So Rita is cosmic order, it's morality, and it's proper action. But I want you to, again, Rita is, it is all these things, but morality is not something that is just a question of right and wrong in a universal sense. Morality is tied up in who you are, where you are, and your caste. What part of society you belong to. And we're going to take a look at that later in the caste system. So when I talk about morality or ethics and proper action, we have to think about it in terms of what you are supposed to do in this lifetime within the context that you were born into. And your morality, something that is moral for you, may not be moral for somebody else. All right, so that, again, we're going to have to remain flexible. One of the main gods in the Vedas is Indra. He is a god of war. He is the slayer of Vitra. Yeah, Vitra. And Vitra was a dragon or some kind of serpent. And he was worshipped by the Aryans, and supposedly, he was kind of the god that led them to victory. He kills Vitra to create the world. All right, so remember, it's not entirely consistent. We're going to hear more about this a little bit later. So he is our lovely war god, not entirely unlike Yahweh or Zeus, or and some people would say Allah is a war god as well, but I would have to. It's a much later belief about God, and I think it's a little more complex than that. But Yahweh definitely shares things in common with Baal of the ancient Near East, and Baal is very distinctly a war god. So I think it's fair to say Yahweh was a war god as well. Agni is another god that we are going to be encountering in the Vedas if you read them. He is a child of the water and lightning and earth. All right, so sometimes the water is referred to, water and lightning are kind of the same thing. I'm not entirely sure how that works, but I'm just going with it. He dwelled in all three levels, the earthly plane, the mid-heaven, and then the heavens of the gods. So he is in all three, and he kind of acts as a go-between, a mediator between the gods and humanity. He lives in plants and wood and the fires and of the altars of the earth and the hearth, right? So the home, the place where the fire dwells at home, he is very much connected to fire. And it kind of like if you read Prometheus, right, you have this god of fire that brings fire to humanity. And this is one of the things that Agni does, is he is acting as that go-between via the fire. The fire is in the God's power, but fire is also connecting us to that divine realm. And fire is going to be instrumental to sacrifice. Fire is going to be instrumental to a lot of the rituals. He carried the sacrifices to the gods that were burned and carried the cremated dead to the underworld or the heavens or whatever it is at that moment. So he is carrying the things that are burned to their appropriate places. All right. He is associated with what's called tapas, and that's not in Spanish. Tapas is snacky food, but that's not what this is. Tapas is the creative heat energy of meditation. So if you meditate, you're working up this tapas, you're working up this energy that comes out in the form of heat, which is, of course, related to fire, and therefore Agni is related to that. Next, we have Varuna. So he is the guardian of order, right? He is considered the thousand-eyed. He is all-seeing. He gets lots of sacrifices from people who have in some way violated Rita, right? So if you have violated morality, however that gets defined for you in your time and place, if you have violated that morality, then you have to sacrifice and ask forgiveness from Varuna, okay? Soma is another god. Now here's a really interesting and fun fact. Most ancient traditions have some form of getting high. Okay, and getting high through a hallucinogen or any kind of intoxication is supposed to help you get in touch with the gods. So soma is a plant. It is not the specific plant you're looking at, but I thought it was a good example. They don't know what plant it was. Of course, people have looked for it, but no one's really sure what plant it was because they didn't leave a drawing of it, unfortunately. But it's a plant that has kind of a juice in it, and they ingested it during rituals. And when you did that, apparently you had the feeling of the god's presence. You could see them, and you became very courageous and very, potent and virulent and this kind of thing. And of course, men are primarily, if not entirely, it's the men who do the ritual. And again, very common for ancient religion, especially knowing that 99% sure that all traditions up to this point for humanity have been patriarchal, run by and for men primarily. They called it the sweet drink of life, not lice, the sweet drink of life. And it seems to have been a really good LSD trip or something to that effect. No one really knows, but we still see these things being practiced today. Ayahuasca is a thing. LSD was used for quite a while to kind of create that same feeling. Peyote was used by the Native Americans later on, although that was a late tradition. It was not used early on. But we still get people using lots of things to get them into that mystical mindset. Dancing, fasting, the sweat lodge later on in Native American culture. There's all kinds of ways to do this. This is one of the ways that it was done within the Vedas. All right. You could get the same effect with enough meditation. Oh my gosh, think about Zen monks, right, who meditate 8 to 12 hours a day, right? They're getting in touch with something in there. So all people do this all the time, and I would argue that even when you go to a rave or something, when they're passing out ecstasy, that's a mystical experience, right? Everybody loving everybody else. I've never done it, but this is what I hear about it. But it sounds like a mystical experience, and that falls into part of the categories of religion, right? So getting high is not unusual or uncommon in religious practice. For people, us. People have a soul. It is called Atman. There were 4 classes within the Aryan society. And so this is where the caste system comes from, and we're going to talk about caste in a little bit. So the essence is the soul or the breath, and that is Atman. And again, super common in ancient religion. I'm trying to think, Ruach in Hebrew does the same thing. It's the breath, but it's also kind of the spirit, the soul. So this idea of breath and life being connected, of course, really obvious why, but they get connected in a lot of ancient traditions. So within the 4 classes, we have the Brahmins, and those are the priests or the teachers. And when they talk about this, they talk about this coming from, I think it's Anu, this kind of primordial man, right? The first man, and they carve up Anu to create the 4 classes, and from the mouth come the Brahmins, the teachers, the priests, the people who are supposed to speak the Vedas, right? The warriors and the administrations, they are the kshatriya, and they come from the arms. They're doing the work, right? The normal, everyday, day-to-day work. The Vaishyas, the artisans, the ranchers, the farmers, they come from the thighs, and they're doing the manual labor, right? So they're from the thigh. And then you get the Shudras, and they are the peasants, and they are the feet. And they're carrying society along, doing that hard work in the fields and doing the what we would call menial labor, but I feel like that's really kind of insulting. But they're doing that hard, the plumbers would be another caste. But they're actually picking the fruit from the field and that kind of a thing. Ritual. Home was and still is very much the focus of ritual, right? So ritual is a very personal thing. Specialists in the Vedas, specialists came into the home from about 1500 BCE forward, and they performed rituals for life milestones, right? So births, weddings, death, possibly rituals of entry into adulthood. That would be another ritual. They came in for healing. If you needed luck, if you needed a spell or a ritual done to help you win the lottery, you would call one of the Brahmins to come into your home and do a ritual for that. Likewise for fertility. If you are having trouble getting pregnant or your cows are not reproducing or whatever, they come in and they perform specialized sacrifices and rituals in your home, and early forms. They were specialists, and they were needed because the rituals had to be done right. If the ritual was done incorrectly, at best the ritual was ineffective and it could become dangerous. All right. The words themselves came to be understood as manipulating the universe. So it would be like if you think about, think about Harry Potter, right? And their magic spells are in Latin, but what if they pronounce it wrong and they say the wrong word, right? The spell could go awry. And that was very much the same way that they saw these rituals. If you do it wrong, you're not going to have nothing is going to happen at best, or worst case, the wrong thing happens. Vedic ritual and all of the Vedas are very much focused on life here and now, okay? Day-to-day life. Getting food on the table, getting through childbirth alive, making sure your goats reproduce, making sure the wheat in the field comes up this year. It is not as focused on eternality, but as it will become. Later, the Upanishads, and we're going to talk about them in a few minutes, the Upanishads tend to focus there, and they become much more philosophical. All right. And this is one of the things that we see in religion, is that there's very often a difficulty or they have to make efforts to mix these two sides, right? There's this question of eternality and what's going to happen to your soul after you die or whatever. But then there's that question of getting food on the table today. How do I succeed and survive and provide for my family right now? Right, in the material world, as crude or, as temporary as it may be, I still have to feed my children, or my cats in this case. Tubbins is waiting to be fed. Tubbins is Contessa's nickname, by the way. I still have to feed my cats today, right? And it would be really nice to deny the self and deny the material world and to become philosophical and wax on about eternality and what's going to happen to my soul after I die. But if you've got children crying because they need rice, you need your religion to provide for that too. So the Vedas are very much concerned with that in the moment, right now. How do I get this done? And later we're going to see much more concern about life after death and that kind of a thing. The Rishi are also active at this time, and the Rishi are seers and prophets. So we've always got people look into the future, right? And even today we still do this. Astrology, tarot cards, all kinds of things. Your fortune cookie when you go out to Panda Express, right? Because I know you all love Panda, right? No? Okay, fine. Maybe it's just me. I like panda. The Upanishads, as promised. The Vedas still are orthodoxy. The Upanishads are an addition. All right. They are another sacred text, and they date to about 700 to 500 BCE. And they parallel the rise of philosophy and prophets in Buddhism and Jainism. So, right around 5 to 700, we see a big movement in multiple independent cultures towards prophecy and towards this kind of question of larger spiritual issues. They give a reappraisal of ritual, following desires. They are much more spiritual. So they're kind of saying, don't waste your time on rituals to help you win the lottery. You need to be thinking about your soul and what's going to happen when you're done here, right? So that's the Upanishads. They seem to reflect a growing anxiety in society over death, and the question of whether or not the body and the soul are the same thing. And again, we see this cropping up in ancient Greece around the same time, right? And so if you read Plato or even Aristotle, there's this question in Greece of, is the body connected to the soul? And there are even two different words to describe the body in Greece, ancient Greek, and there's sarx and soma. And one of them is like, sarx is like the body as a crude thing, as a meat sock, I guess, and kind of putting it kind of grossly, but and soma is kind of like this more holistic idea of the body and the soul. So this question of how connected is the soul to the body, question of, am I my body? And this is what the Upanishads is asking and moving in that direction. The material world is not the whole story. There is more. And again, this goes back to that spiritual quest. What's going on beyond the material world after I die, past my own existence? And so there becomes a combination of concern for now and the crops and then life after death. And they're trying to balance those two things. And the Upanishads lead us into the classical age of Hinduism. And when we talk about Hinduism today, it's really coming out after the Upanishads have been written or produced and disseminated. And that's going to lead us more into classical Hinduism. Major tenets in Hinduism today, as going back to the Upanishads at least, and probably before that, but at least to the Upanishads, major tenets include reincarnation or transmigration of the soul. So you're born into a body, you do your thing, and you die, and you're born into another body. Within Hinduism, you can be reborn as anything. You could be reborn as a cockroach. You could be reborn as a cat. You could be reborn as a human being or a deva, right? So you could be reborn as a divine being. You could be a god in your next life. It's entirely possible. So anything is open for that. What determines how you come back is your actions in this life, right? And I think we all know exactly where this is going. Karma. Karma is the action and its consequences. And those of you who are familiar with Buddhism are very familiar with this idea. And even in American culture and common culture, we talk about karma. I know my friends and I often make jokes about the karma train, right? The karma train ran him over because he or she was a jerk. Ran over it, maybe backed up, ran over them again, if it's really bad. Karma is about consequences of your actions. Your actions may be ritual actions or moral actions, right? So it's either one. You can incur good karma or bad karma. If you incur good karma, you hopefully will move up on the scale of beings, right? And not be born back as a cockroach or something like that. If you have majority good karma, of course, you increase your station in life. If you have majority bad karma, you're going to have to work that off somehow. And the penal code might be you come back as a snail. Hopefully not. In Jainism, karma seems to be kind of a thing that clings to the soul and weighs you down. So So Jainism is a part of the Hindu landscape, but it's a little bit different, but it's still part of that diverse landscape. In classical Hinduism, karma is kind of like the energy that ripples. Like if you think about a pebble being thrown into a pond, the ripples that come out from that pebble, but then there's kind of a what's the word I'm looking for? A reaction as well, and the ripples come back as well. So if you create good, harmonious ripples that go out, then you will have them come back to you as well. So returning karma is called the fruiting or the ripening of karma, and it may take more than one lifetime, right? So karma is not necessarily something that is going to happen in this lifetime. It might not. You may have to be reborn to work off some of your karma. If you were a, mass murderer or something horrible like that, yeah, it's gonna take a little while to work that off. The law of karma, though, is impersonal. It does not care about the emotionality involved. It is the law. It's kind of like speeding down the freeway. The cop doesn't, in theory, the cop doesn't really care who you are or why you were speeding. You were speeding, you broke the law, right? At least in theory. But this question then comes up. If karma is about morality, what does morality mean? And this is where we're going to start looking into questions of caste and whatnot. But before we do that, when we talk about reincarnation and karma, there's a word that encapsulates the Hindu idea of eternal rebirth, and that is samsara. The wheel of samsara. You cannot escape the wheel of samsara. All the yogis, all the enlightened ones are the real ultimate goal there, if you have the opportunity to pursue it, is to escape the wheel of samsara. And they don't look at it necessarily as living over and over and over again. They look at it as dying over and over and over again. So it's not a good thing. It's not a happy thing. This reincarnation bit really sucks. They would be perfectly happy to get off the wheel of samsara, but that's not how they understand it. So you could come back as an animal or a deva or whatever, but you're still stuck on the wheel of samsara. You're not getting off of it anytime soon, and very few people ever have. So this question of eternally living is not necessarily a good thing. They really see it as kind of life brings inevitable suffering. And we see this in Buddhism. You're going to hear a lot of things that are going to relate to Buddhism because Buddhism really comes out of Hinduism. And in many ways, they overlap. And you're going to see elements, obviously, of Hinduism and Buddhism. But in Hinduism, you're going to see things adopted from Buddhism, and Buddhism is going to keep some of these elements of Hinduism as well. And depending on where the Buddhism is that you're looking at, you may see more or less Hindu influence, all right, depending on the culture it's in. So the goal of yogis and other masters is to escape the wheel of samsara because they're trying to escape the inevitable suffering of life over and over and over again. It is not an optimistic point of view. Dharma. Dharma is your appointed duty within your caste, and whether or not you do the correct dharma is going to indicate whether or not you have good or bad karma. All right? Dharma is a little bit difficult to get your head around, so we're going to have to go into the caste system to really understand Dharma in the classical Hindu way. Okay? And again, Dharma is a word that you might hear within Buddhism. A lot of times we talk about the Bodhidharma, and that's an idea that everybody has an inner Buddha, an inner enlightened being. But this is not what Hinduism is looking at. Okay? So what is caste? Within classical Hinduism, there are 4 castes, basically coming from the Vedic period, which we kind of looked at before, but we're going to kind of get more detail now. The first thing you want to know is that caste is a social, political, economic, and religious organization. Okay? It organizes all aspects of Indian life, or it did, and it's becoming less so now. In 1947, the caste system was outlawed once they gained independence from England. It was outlawed, but of course, if any culture is going to hold on to tradition, it's India. And so the caste system has kind of maintained its hold de facto, even though de jure it is no longer legal. Okay? So within classical Hinduism, you're born into a caste and there you shall stay, no matter what. You cannot work your way out of your caste. You are born into that particular caste based on your karma in previous lives. The hierarchy is based on ritual purity. So the top of the caste is the most ritually pure and must remain ritually pure. The bottom of the caste is not ritually pure, and they take care of the dirty things that we'll talk about later on in a few minutes. There are 4 castes based on the Vedic tradition. There are the Brahmins. Now, like I said before, these are the priests and the teachers. Their job, their whole job, is to receive gifts from other castes, from other classes, so that others can receive good karma. So their job is to help other people incur good karma, and that is their dharma. That is their job. All right? They are ritually pure, and therefore they have a lot of restrictions on them. Their status is dictated by their previous lives. So if you have a Brahman who's a jerk, you just kind of have to take it because he was born into this high caste for a reason based on his previous lives. And if he's a jerk in this life, maybe he will go down, right? And in the next life, maybe he'll be born into a lower caste, or maybe, a cockroach, depending on how bad he is, or she. So the Brahmins are the most ritually pure, and therefore they are the most, the highest level of caste, and their whole job is to receive gifts to help you get into a better life. And the Brahmins make up about 7 to 9% of the Indian population. Kshatriyas, these are the warriors and the administrators. Their whole job is to protect the world and the order that it's in, right? So they're part of their job is to protect from foreign enemies. So if you're a king, or if you're a warrior, or if you're the accountant for the whatever, part of your job is to protect people from foreign enemies. You should not shrink back from battle, and this can be actual battle, or it could also be, metaphoric battle in the administrative part. Your job is to honor the Brahmins, to seek, you should seek peaceful resolution if you possibly can, but if you have to go to battle, you cannot shrink back. You cannot, pull the run away kind of a thing. Your job is to keep the order of the world, including the order of the caste system itself, and to also keep the weak from being bullied by the stronger, right? Even within castes. So it's your job to keep order, to keep justice, to make sure that people are honoring their station, their lot in life. This is your job. This is what you do. And that is the end of that story. The Vaishyas, they are the merchants, the artisans, and the farmers. Their whole job is to be attentive to business. Whatever business you're in, that is your job. Your job is to circulate money, make the money go around, pay people, be paid, kind of doing that basic day-to-day, keep the economy and the world going. Make sure that fabrics are available to everybody else, make sure that food is available, make sure that furniture is available, etc. The Shudras. The Shudras are the peasants. They are doing the kind of, like I said, I don't really like the term menial labor, but I can't come up with a better word right now. But they're doing that, the really hard physical labor. The Shudra's highest duty is to serve the Brahmins. They should be free from pride. They are gentle. And even if they are emancipated, because in a way they are kind of a slave class, Even if they are emancipated, they are not released from servitude because that is their birth station. That is their caste. And you cannot get out of your own caste. All right? So there are all kinds of stories that come out of India about caste. For example, there was a story about a man who was in India studying, and he had hired a young man who needed to provide for his family. And he had hired this guy to, kind of help clean up around his house and be his assistant. And his grandmother or his mother-in-law, somebody in his family, an elder matriarch, was really mad at him because he was working below his caste. He was not doing the thing that his caste was supposed to do, even if it paid better than what he was supposed to do, right? Even though he was caught in a sort of, I need to provide for my family, but this job is not within my caste. And so he was very much shunned by his I think it was a grandmother, by the matriarch, because he was not incurring good karma. He was not supporting Rita. He was not promoting and contributing and supporting this kind of cosmic order established by the Vedas and established for his caste. So he was violating his caste, which meant that he was incurring bad karma, even though what he was doing was a good thing. So we go back to this dharma karma thing. His dharma was to be a businessman, and yet he was working as either a Vaishya or a Shudra, and that was not part of his karmic destiny. And so he was not fulfilling his dharma. So his karma that he was incurring was negative karma. All right. So this isn't about morality. Like I said, it's not about morality in the way that we normally think of morality. The final caste that's not really a caste, they're kind of outside the caste system. Those are the Dalit. They have also been called the untouchables historically. They call themselves Dalit now because Dalit has to do with like the broken, the oppressed, the kind of the forgotten ones. So they are ritually unclean. And they're ritually unclean not because of the work they do necessarily, although that does contribute to it, but they're ritually unclean because they are outside the caste system. So a child born who has never done anything yet, an infant, is still ritually unclean because they are not part of the caste system. So because they exist outside the formal system of society and culture, they're the ones that get to clean up. They're the ones that get to deal with dead things. So they are the undertakers, they are the plumbers, they are the ones that are dealing with the really dirty and ritually unclean stuff. They are the embodiment of ritual impurity. They have no strictly defined role, but to touch one of them, even with your eyes, right? So remember, Veda has to do with vision. So seeing is very important. So for a Brahman to even look upon in somewhat times in the classical period, for a Brahman to even look at a Dalit created ritual impurity within the caste system. They are not supposed to use or were not supposed to use public bathrooms. The caste system did become outlawed in 1947, but again, old habits die really, really hard in India. And another example of how the caste system has worked, another story that came down to me from a professor this time, he was talking about, he was in India studying, and he knew a doctor who worked in a hospital. And this doctor said that, when they were stuck, when they could not figure out a case, they went to a janitor. There was a janitor that worked in the hospital who cleaned up the worst of the worst from patients. And this janitor, like, always had an answer. If you were ever perplexed by a case, if you ever didn't know what to do, you would go to this janitor. And the question became, what is this janitor? Who is he? Why does he have all the answers? And it turns out this janitor had been trained in medicine. He was a medical doctor, and he had been trained at a really good school in the West. But when he came back to India, because he had been born a Dalit into the untouchable caste, he could not practice medicine. So he did the best he could. He worked in a hospital and he helped doctors, but he was not allowed, no matter how talented, no matter how well educated, it didn't matter. He was not allowed to practice medicine and work with patients, because for other patients, especially the Brahmins, for them to be touched, for them to be looked upon, for them to be observed by, or for them to observe this Dalit person, again, even if this guy was going to save their lives, this guy's breaking of the moral order, breaking of Rita, was against the Dharma. And therefore, his actions would have bad karma consequences, and it could create bad karma for other people who become ritually impure for being in contact with him. All right? It's kind of crazy. It took me a little bit to get my head around all of this as well. All right. So we're back to Dharma. Remember Dharma? And I touched on it very briefly before. So if you are a warrior in the warrior class and you become a salesman, you are violating your Dharma. And you are disrupting the moral order of the universe and creating bad karma for yourself and other people. All right. I think that's going to do it for this episode. I feel like we've done quite a lot already. When we come back in the next lecture, we're going to take a look at the deities, and we're going to take a look at some of the ritual. So we're going to look at Shiva and Vishnu, and one of my favorites, Kali. I do love Kali. She's one of those gods that really embraces the dark and the light. She acknowledges the darkness of reality, but then kind of welcomes in, kind of creates a doorway, an opening for the light to come in. So we're going to look at her. I also love Ganesh, so we'll take a look at Ganesh, the elephant-headed god. And we're going to take a look at some of the rituals within Hinduism. All right, so until then, please stay well. Please stay home. Please make sure your families are doing well. And hopefully, again, I am super, super hopeful that I will see you guys next semester. Don't forget to register for classes and act optimistically. All right, so keep yourselves up and optimistic and happy and planning for the future. Certainly, this whole quarantine thing changes a lot, but keep going forward. And please remember, even though we're not in class, this just means that you really need to take more responsibility for your education. So please don't, I understand if horrible things happen, you need some extra help. I am here for you. But please don't get lazy and procrastinate too much, because I want to make sure that the energy you've put into this semester so far does not go to waste. All right. So please remember, you've got to get 3 grades in for me to give you a grade. Okay. And otherwise, you're missing a third of your grade and you're going to fail the class. Okay. And I do not want to fail anybody. It breaks my heart when people fail. So please, please, please don't break my heart. Okay. I will see you guys soon. Have a good week. Bye-bye.